It begins in a way that feels almost comforting. A sunny afternoon, a quiet neighborhood, a sleepover that looks like 100 others' pizza boxes on the table, soda cans sweating onto the floor, laughter spilling out of a bedroom as three 12-year-old girls talk about school, games, and stories that make them feel brave and scared at the same time. Nothing about the moment suggests danger. Nothing signals that anything irreversible is about to happen. It feels ordinary, safe, familiar. The kind of memory parents expect to look back on with nostalgia. Later, the girls leave the house together. No shouting, no running, just a casual walk into the nearby woods. The sun filters through the trees. Birds move through the branches. This is not the setting of a nightmare. It's the setting of childhood. And that's what makes what follows so unsettling. Because whatever we imagine evil looks like, it rarely starts this quietly. Pause here. Let that contrast sit. Because the question isn't what happened in those woods. The real question is what happened long before they ever stepped outside. What happens when a fictional story stops being entertainment and becomes truth? This is often described as a monster story. That framing misses something essential. The figure at the center, Slender Man, is not the true focus here. He has no body, no voice, no confirmed origin. He exists only as images, forum posts, videos, and whispers pass from one screen to another. The real subject of this story is belief, how it forms, how it grows, and how the internet, unlike old campfire tales, never lets a story fade. For generations, scary stories ended when the flashlight clicked off. Daylight broke their spell. Parents reassured children that monsters weren't real, and eventually, fear dissolved into embarrassment or laughter. But online, stories don't end. They refresh, they repeat, they evolve, they surround. And for young minds still learning how reality works, repetition can feel like proof. In this case, belief didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, reinforced by images that looked real, by stories written with authority, by the absence of an adult voice saying, "This isn't true." Inside that echo chamber, imagination hardened into conviction. Fear gained rules. Stories gained consequences. And fiction took on weight. The girl who survived, Peyton Leutner, would later become the human reminder of what happens when belief goes unchecked. But in this opening moment, she is just a friend, a classmate, someone trusted enough to follow into the woods without hesitation. There is no villain standing in front of them, only an idea standing behind them. That is what makes this story so disturbing. Not rage, not cruelty, not thrill-seeking. They didn't think they were doing something evil. They believed they were doing something necessary. To understand this story, we have to slow down and remove the noise that usually surrounds it. Strip away the headlines, the panic, the exaggerated fear. What remains is not a spectacle, but a quiet, unsettling reality involving a child named Peyton Leutner. There is no need for graphic detail here, because the truth of what happened does not depend on violence itself. It depends on why it happened and how something unreal came to feel real enough to guide actions. The setting matters. This took place in Waukesha, a town that looks like countless others across the United States. Tree-lined streets, schools, parks, backyards. A place where children ride bikes, attend sleepovers, and walk to class without fear. Nothing about Waukesha suggests darkness or danger. That ordinariness is essential to the story. It reminds us that this didn't happen in isolation or in some distant, broken place. It happened in a community that trusted normalcy. And the ages matter even more. Everyone involved was 12 years old. Children, not delinquents, not criminals, not kids with long histories of violence or abuse. They were students, friends, classmates, still learning how the world works, still forming their understanding of reality, consequence, and truth. When adults hear this case, there's often an instinct to search for evil intent. But intent here is complicated. These were not minds hardened by experience. They were minds still under construction. This is where the story shifts away from easy explanations. It is tempting to point at the internet and declare it the villain, but that shortcut misses the deeper issue. The internet didn't force anything. What it did quietly, persistently, was provide an environment where belief could grow without interruption. Stories were always available. They could be accessed at any hour, revisited endlessly, shared with friends who reinforced them rather than questioned them. And crucially, they existed without consistent adult interpretation, no one present to say, "This is fiction," in a way that stuck. Children don't experience stories the way adults do. For them, repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates credibility. When an idea appears often enough, in enough places, told by enough voices, it can stop feeling like imagination and start feeling like knowledge. Especially when that idea offers explanations for fear, rules for behavior, and consequences for disobedience. At the center of this case is Slender Man. He is not introduced here as a villain in the traditional sense, but as a symbol. Slender Man represents a new kind of folklore, one born online, shaped collectively, and never allowed to fade. Unlike old myths that lived briefly and then disappeared, this one stayed present, evolving through images, stories, and discussions that felt authoritative simply because they existed everywhere. This introduction is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding how belief forms in young minds when fiction is constant, social, and unchallenged. Because until we understand that process, we are only reacting to the outcome, never the cause. To understand how this story reached the real world, we first have to understand the kind of myth that shaped it. Long before anything happened in the woods, the foundation was laid online, in a space where stories don't behave the way they used to. This is where Creepypasta comes in, modern campfire tales, designed not for a single night, but for endless replay. Creepypasta is internet folklore. The name itself comes from copy-paste, because these stories are meant to be shared, reposted, rewritten, and reshaped. Unlike traditional horror stories with clear authors and endings, Creepypasta lives in fragments. A paragraph here, an image there, a forum comment adding a detail, a YouTube video dramatizing a moment that never happened. Together, these pieces form a story that feels collective rather than invented. No single voice owns it, which makes it harder to dismiss. In the past, scary stories were temporary. They belonged to a moment told around a fire, whispered at a sleepover, exaggerated in the dark. When morning came, they lost their power. The setting changed, the teller moved on, and the story faded into memory. Creepypasta doesn't fade. It waits. It refreshes. It reappears exactly where it left off. This environment is where Slender Man emerged, and his origin is part of what made him so powerful. He didn't come from a book, a movie, or a known storyteller. He appeared anonymously. First, his images paired with short captions. No name attached, no clear explanation. Just a tall, faceless figure in the background of ordinary scenes, standing where he didn't belong. That anonymity mattered. It gave the impression that the story wasn't being told, it was being discovered. There was no single author to point to and say, "This person made it up." Instead, hundreds of people contributed. Someone added a story. Someone else added a rule. Another person created a video. Forums debated what Slender Man could do, where he lived, how he punished those who disobeyed him. Over time, the character stopped feeling like fiction and started feeling like a puzzle. And puzzles invite participation. Unlike traditional monsters, Slender Man had no fixed mythology. Vampires have rules. Werewolves have transformations. Ghosts are bound to places. Slender Man had none of that. His lack of limits became his defining feature. He could appear anywhere. He could influence minds. He could punish disbelief. The absence of rules made him adaptable to any fear a reader already had. He didn't replace imagination, he absorbed it. This is one reason Slender Man felt different from earlier fictional creatures. He wasn't presented as a character in a story. He was framed as something hidden, something uncovered by accident. The tone of many creepypasta posts suggested secrecy rather than storytelling. People don't to talk about this. You're not supposed to know. If you see him, it's already too late. That framing is powerful, especially to young readers. It suggests that disbelief isn't safety, it's ignorance. The internet amplified this effect. Images were edited to look authentic. Videos were shot in shaky, amateur styles that mimicked real footage. Comment sections acted like witnesses rather than audiences. People didn't say, "I like this story." They said, "This happened to me," or "My cousin saw him," or "You shouldn't joke about this." Each comment reinforced the idea that Slender Man wasn't just a story, he was a shared secret. For children and preteens, this distinction matters deeply. They are still learning how authority works. In school, information comes from repetition and consensus. When many voices say the same thing, it feels true. Online, Slender Man had consensus. He appeared across platforms, formats, and communities. There was no clear line marking where fiction ended and roleplay began. To a developing mind, the consistency itself became evidence. Another crucial difference between digital myths and traditional legends is accessibility. Old stories required effort to find. You had to hear them from someone else, seek out a book, or be in the right place at the right time. Online myths require nothing. They are always available, always one click away, always ready to reassert themselves. Fear doesn't need to be remembered. It can be refreshed on demand. And because creepypasta is social, belief doesn't grow alone. Children encounter these stories together, discuss them together, and reinforce them together. Doubt becomes difficult when peers share the same fear. Questioning the story can feel like risking punishment, not from a monster, but from social exclusion. Belief becomes safer than skepticism. This is the core danger of a digital myth like Slender Man. Not that it exists, but that it persists. Not that it scares, but that it structures fear. Over time, the story stops being entertainment and starts offering explanations. Why bad things happen. Why you feel watched. What you must do to stay safe. When a story begins answering questions, it stops being passive. It becomes a belief system. The key idea is simple, but unsettling. Old legends faded when the fire went out. Online legends never turn off. They don't weaken with daylight. They don't disappear when adults leave the room. They live in pockets of constant access, waiting to be revisited, expanded, and believed again. And when belief is allowed to grow without guidance, it doesn't remain harmless for everyone. To understand how this story moved from screen to reality, we have to step away from the myth itself and look inward toward the developing mind. Children do not experience stories the way adults do. They don't carry the same filters, the same skepticism, or the same lived experience that helps separate symbolism from fact. For preteens, reality is still being assembled, and belief is often built from emotion rather than evidence. At this age, thinking tends to be black and white. Things are good or bad, safe or dangerous, real or fake. Nuance comes later. Metaphor is difficult, especially when it isn't clearly labeled as such. When a story presents itself seriously, using realistic images, confident language, and warnings instead of jokes, it bypasses the "this is pretend" category altogether. The mind doesn't ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "What does this mean for me?" Online folklore exploits that vulnerability without intending to. Stories like Slender Man aren't framed as fairy tales. They're framed as discoveries. They use the language of truth. Photographs, eyewitness-style accounts, warnings, timelines. To a child, those elements signal authority. Adults trust information that looks official. Children do too only without the tools to verify it. When something looks real often enough, it starts to feel real. This difficulty separating metaphor from literal truth is intensified by repetition. A single scary story can be dismissed. Hundreds of similar stories across platforms cannot. Each retelling strengthens the impression that something must be there. Children don't see a recycled myth. They see confirmation. And confirmation creates certainty. That certainty becomes even stronger when belief is shared. Fear is rarely solitary online. Children encounter these stories together, talk about them together, and build on them together. One child introduces the idea. Another adds a detail. A third finds an image or video that seems to support it. Soon, the belief no longer belongs to one person. It belongs to the group. And once belief is shared, doubt becomes dangerous. In private online spaces, group chats, forums, late-night browsing sessions, there is often no adult voice present to challenge or contextualize what's being consumed. No one pauses the story to explain how fiction works, how images can be manipulated, how communities sometimes roleplay without boundaries. Instead, the narrative grows unchecked. When everyone in the room believes, disbelief feels like betrayal. This is how fear becomes normalized. Instead of asking whether something is real, the group begins asking what must be done about it. Over time, fear stops being emotional and starts becoming structural. It gains rules. These rules may not be written anywhere, but they are understood. Don't talk about it too loudly. Don't mock it. Don't ignore the warnings. Following the rules brings a sense of safety, not because the threat is real, but because obedience feels protective. Rewards appear as well. Believing can make a child feel special, chosen, informed. Knowing the rules of a hidden world gives a sense of control over fear. Instead of being a victim of something unknown, the child becomes a participant in something understood. Fear transforms into purpose, and then there is punishment. In many online myths, punishment is implied rather than described. Bad things happen to people who don't believe, who laugh, who disobey. This is particularly powerful for children, whose understanding of consequences is still concrete and immediate. The idea that disbelief itself could cause harm flips logic on its head, but belief doesn't need logic to function. It needs emotion. Belief doesn't need to be logical to feel real, especially to a child. What's important here is intent. This process is not driven by cruelty or malice. It is driven by vulnerability. Children want the world to make sense. When a story offers explanations, however dark, they can feel comforting. The fear becomes manageable because it has a shape, a name, rules. In a confusing world, even a frightening war can feel better than chaos. Adults often underestimate how immersive these belief systems can be. We assume children know the difference between real and fake because we know the difference. But that knowledge comes from years of exposure, correction, and context. Without guidance, children fill in the gaps themselves. And once belief is formed, challenging it isn't as simple as saying, "That's not real." To a child, that can feel like someone denying gravity. Judgment has no place in this story. These were not children seeking to harm. They were children seeking safety, certainty, and belonging within a narrative that spiraled beyond their ability to question it. The danger was not imagination. It was imagination left alone, reinforced by peers, and never grounded by perspective. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the case. When belief is shaped in isolation, without adult interpretation, fear can become instruction. Stories can become obligations. And the line between pretending and doing can quietly disappear, not because children are broken, but because they are still becoming. To understand how a story crossed the line into real-world action, we have to resist the instinct to focus on mechanics. The how is not only disturbing, it's also misleading. It tempts the mind to search for brutality where the real driver was belief. The truth is quieter and far more unsettling. This was not an act driven by excitement, anger, or impulse. It was driven by a sense of obligation. At the center of that obligation was a belief system that had slowly taken shape. Within that system, Slender Man was no longer just a story. He had become a presence, one that watched, judged, and responded to behavior. The idea wasn't that he was entertaining or frightening in the abstract. The idea was that he required something. And requirements create pressure. In the logic of this belief, appeasement mattered. Stories suggested that obedience brought safety, while defiance invited punishment. This is a pattern seen in many mythologies and belief systems throughout history. When a figure is portrayed as powerful but unseen, the fear is not what it has done, it's what it might do if ignored. That uncertainty keeps belief alive. The children involved did not feel they were choosing violence. They felt they were responding to a demand. Fear of consequences played a central role. Not consequences imposed by adults or society, but consequences imagined within the belief itself. In their understanding, failing to act didn't mean nothing would happen. It meant something worse would. Harm redirected, punishment transferred, safety withdrawn. This is how fear reframes morality. Action becomes protection, and inaction becomes danger. It's important to say clearly what this was not. This was not thrill-seeking. There was no search for excitement, no desire for chaos, no sense of fun. Thrill-seeking usually carries adrenaline, risk-taking, and emotional highs. This situation carried anxiety, pressure, and a sense of inevitability. This was not rage. There was no explosion of anger, no loss of control. Rage is loud. It seeks release. What happened here was quiet, deliberate, and rooted in fear rather than fury. Instead, this was perceived duty. Within their belief system, a moral line had formed. There was a right choice and a wrong one. Right meant obedience, protection, survival. Wrong meant defiance, danger, catastrophic consequence. Once a belief is framed in moral terms, it stops being optional. It demands compliance. The children didn't feel they were making a choice between good and bad actions. They felt they were choosing between preventing disaster and allowing it. This is one of the most dangerous transformations belief can undergo. When a story shifts from "this is scary" to "this is required," it begins to override empathy. Empathy relies on recognizing another person's feelings and humanity. But moralized belief reframes people as variables within a larger rule system. The individual becomes secondary to the perceived necessity of the act. In this mindset, harm is not the goal, it's collateral. The focus isn't on what someone will suffer, but on what must be done to fulfill an obligation. This doesn't erase responsibility, but it explains the internal logic. The children believed they were preventing something worse. That belief didn't make sense objectively, but it made sense to them within the framework they had built and reinforced together. Once belief reaches this stage, imagination no longer feels like imagination. It feels like knowledge. The story stops being flexible. Doubt feels dangerous. Questioning the belief feels like inviting punishment. And when doubt disappears, so does the ability to step back and reassess. This is where fantasy becomes action, not suddenly, not dramatically, but through gradual narrowing of options. The belief system doesn't present a menu of choices. It presents a single path labeled necessary. Everything else is labeled risk. For a child, especially one already anxious or impressionable, that narrowing can feel absolute. Adults often ask, why didn't they stop? The answer is uncomfortable. Stopping would have felt immoral. It would have felt like choosing harm. In their minds, empathy was not absent. It was overridden by fear framed as responsibility. The key idea here is not that belief erased conscience, but that it redefined it. Once a belief becomes moral, right versus wrong, it gains power over emotion. Empathy becomes negotiable. Fear becomes justification. Action becomes duty. This is why focusing only on the act misses the point. The real warning lies earlier, in the moment when fiction stops being a story and starts becoming a rulebook. When belief shifts from what if to we must, the danger is no longer the myth itself. It's the authority we unknowingly granted. They believed they were preventing something worse. And belief, when left unchallenged, can convince a child that harm is not cruelty but responsibility. Reality did not arrive gradually. It crashed in all at once. One moment, the world was governed by a story rules shaped by fear, obligation, and belief. The next, that story collapsed under the weight of consequences no myth could contain. Authorities entered the scene. Emergency responders replaced imagined threats with real urgency. Medical professionals focused not on symbolism or belief, but on saving a life. Fantasy had no language here. Only facts mattered. For Peyton Leutner, the shift from imagination to reality was immediate and unforgiving. She became not a character in a story, but a patient in need of urgent care. Hospitals do not recognize folklore. They respond to injury, blood loss, and time. The presence of doctors and nurses marked the absolute end of the narrative world the children had been living in. Whatever they believed moments earlier could no longer protect them from what had happened. Families were pulled into the aftermath without warning. Parents who had sent their children to a sleepover, expecting memories, returned to a reality they could never have imagined. Shock does not arrive meekly. It fractures households, reshapes identities, and leaves questions no parent is prepared to answer. How could this happen? Who failed? Where did the moment of no return begin? Authorities, too, were forced to confront something unfamiliar. This was not a case of adult criminal intent. It was not fueled by drugs, gangs, or long-standing patterns of violence. It involved children whose actions could not be understood without confronting belief, development, and mental health. Law enforcement deals in responsibility, but this case demanded something more complex: interpretation. Broad legal outcomes followed, but they are not the heart of this story. What matters is not the paperwork or proceedings, but the recognition that something deeper was at play. The system had to respond, but response alone could not explain what had occurred. Justice systems are designed to address actions. This case demanded attention to minds. Mental health professionals became central to understanding the aftermath. Evaluations revealed severe psychological distress, not theatrical villainy. Experts recognized that the beliefs driving the actions were not casual fantasies or jokes taken too far. They were deeply internalized fears, reinforced over time, and experienced as real threats. This distinction matters. Understanding is not excusing. Explaining is not forgiving. Recognizing psychological distress does not erase harm, but it does clarify responsibility in a way punishment alone cannot. The goal of mental health assessment was not to absolve, but to prevent repetition, to identify how belief overwhelmed judgment and how similar pathways might exist for other vulnerable children. This is where public reaction began to split. Media coverage moved fast, and fear moved faster. Headlines leaned towards simplicity. The internet made them do it. Screenshots of creepy images. Warnings about websites. Panic framed as protection. For many adults, the case confirmed a long-held anxiety that the digital world is dangerous, uncontrollable, and corrupting. But fear-driven narratives rarely teach lessons. They teach avoidance. The internet became a convenient villain because it was easier than confronting the more uncomfortable truth that belief formation is complex, and that children do not navigate digital spaces the same way adults do. Blaming technology offered relief. It suggested a solution as simple as restriction, removal, or bans. Turn it off, and the problem disappears. Yet the deeper analysis told a different story. The internet did not invent fear. It amplified it. It did not command action. It failed to interrupt belief. The real vulnerability lay in unsupervised meaning-making, in children encountering powerful stories without guidance, context, or challenge. Panic headlines focused on the monster. Thoughtful analysis focused on the mind. This divide matters because panic feels productive while often being ineffective. Fear encourages control rather than conversation. It encourages silence rather than curiosity. And silence is where belief grows unchecked. The aftermath left a lasting question not just for families or communities, but for society as a whole. Did panic help prevent the next tragedy? Or did it distract from the real lesson that children need tools to question what they consume, not just rules to restrict it? Reality intruded, as it always does. It exposed the limits of stories, the cost of belief without grounding, and the danger of oversimplified blame. The fantasy world collapsed instantly, but the conditions that allowed it to form remained quiet, unresolved, and waiting to be understood. The tragedy did not end when the story broke. It continued in how we chose to explain it. The Slender Man case did not end in 2014. What ended was a moment. What continued was a pattern. If anything, the environment that allowed belief to harden into conviction has only grown stronger. The tools have changed. The platforms have multiplied. The speed has increased. But the underlying risk remains the same. Stories that feel real, shared without context, absorbed without interruption. Today's digital folklore looks different, but it follows the same rules. TikTok myth cycles rise and spread at breathtaking speed. A strange video appears, unexplained sounds, distorted images, warnings hidden in captions. Within hours, thousands of responses add theories, evidence, and personal claims. The algorithm rewards mystery. Engagement fuels visibility. Skepticism rarely goes viral, but fear often does. ARG's alternate reality games push this even further. These are deliberately designed experiences that blur fiction and reality. They scatter clues across platforms, encourage collaboration, and reward belief with progress. For adults, ARGs are entertainment. For children, especially younger ones, they can feel like discovery. The line between participation and belief becomes thin when the game never announces itself as a game. And now there is AI-generated evidence. Images that look photographic but never happened. Videos that simulate eyewitness footage. Voices that sound real but aren't. For a developing mind, realism has always been a shortcut to truth. AI removes one of the last visual barriers between fiction and reality. The question, is this real? Becomes harder to answer even for adults. This matters because children are more vulnerable now than ever before. Not because they are weaker, but because the environment is stronger. Content is always on. There is no natural stopping point. No closing book. No lights out moment when the story ends. Fear can be revisited endlessly, reinforced whenever anxiety resurfaces. Stories no longer live in memory. They live in pockets, ready to be summoned. Consumption is increasingly private. Children explore digital spaces alone, late at night on personal devices. There is no shared living room, no overheard conversation, no adult presence to casually challenge what's being seen. Belief forms quietly. By the time it surfaces, it may already feel settled. Myths also evolve faster. Old legends took years to change. Today, a story can mutate in hours. Corrections lag behind. Context disappears. By the time an adult hears about a trend, it may already be outdated or deeply internalized. This is why banning, blocking, and panicking are not enough. Fear-based responses feel protective, but they often miss the real target. Children don't need a world without stories. They need a world where stories are navigable, where questioning is modeled, not punished, where curiosity is guided instead of suppressed. What actually helps is media literacy, not as a school subject, but as a daily habit. Teaching children how images can be manipulated, how algorithms work, how communities sometimes role-play seriously, not in lectures, but in conversation. Not as warnings, but as shared exploration. Open conversations matter more than restrictions. When children feel safe admitting fear, belief loses its grip. Silence strengthens myths. Dialogue weakens them. Asking, "What do you think this means?" is more powerful than saying, "Don't look at that." Curiosity should replace fear. When adults respond to strange online content with calm interest instead of alarm, they model skepticism without dismissal. They show that questioning is allowed and expected. This doesn't diminish imagination. It strengthens discernment. Most importantly, children need to be taught how to question, not just what to avoid. Avoidance assumes danger is obvious. It isn't. Belief rarely announces itself as belief. It arrives disguised as concern, responsibility, or secret knowledge. The Slender Man case is often remembered as a warning about the internet. It's more accurate to see it as a warning about belief without guidance. The monster was not the cause. The silence around questioning was. Stories will always exist. Myths will always evolve. Technology will always outpace comfort. The choice we face is not whether children encounter digital folklore, but whether they encounter it alone. Because when belief forms in isolation, it doesn't need logic to grow. It only needs space. Slow down now. Let the noise fall away. Strip this story back to its simplest truth. This was never really about Slender Man. He's the name people remember because names are easier than questions. Monsters give fear a shape. They allow us to point, label, and move on. But the figure itself, faceless, fictional, endlessly reinterpreted, was only a vessel. The real force at work here was belief. How it forms, how it hardens, and how dangerous it can become when it grows without guidance. Urban legends have always existed. For centuries, people gathered in the dark and told stories meant to thrill, frighten, and bond. Those stories carried power, but they were temporary. They belonged to a place and a moment. When the fire burned low, the story ended. When the sun rose, fear dissolved. Daylight didn't just reveal the world. It broke the spell. Online, there is no daylight. Stories do not fade. They refresh. They repeat. They wait patiently to be rediscovered by the next curious mind. An image saved once can resurface years later unchanged, carrying the same emotional weight. A rumor doesn't weaken with time. It multiplies. Digital folklore doesn't need memory. It has permanence. That permanence changes how belief behaves. When a child encounters a frightening story today, it doesn't end when the screen turns off. It lingers. It follows. It can be revisited in private, reinforced by strangers, and expanded by communities that feel authoritative simply because they exist. Fear is no longer a passing emotion. It can become a companion. The danger here is not the internet itself. Technology did not invent imagination, fear, or curiosity. Those have always been part of childhood, and fiction is not the enemy. Stories are how humans learn, explore, and make sense of the world. Removing them would not protect children, it would impoverish them. The real danger lies elsewhere. Belief without guidance. When children are left alone to interpret powerful narratives, they do the only thing they can. They fill in the gaps. They assign meaning. They create rules. They search for safety within the story itself. And once belief becomes a source of order, it resists being dismantled. Challenging, it can feel like challenging reality. Adults often underestimate this process. We assume children can separate fantasy from truth because we can. But that separation is learned, not innate. It comes from years of correction, conversation, and context. Without those anchors, belief floats freely untethered from skepticism. grounded only in repetition and emotion. This is why panic is such a poor teacher. After tragedies like this, fear-driven responses surge. Calls to ban platforms, to restrict access, to lock the doors tighter. Those reactions are understandable, but they are incomplete. Fear teaches children that certain topics are forbidden, not that they are questionable. It drives curiosity underground, where belief grows in silence. Guidance works differently. Guidance invites conversation. It treats children as thinkers, not liabilities. It acknowledges fear without validating it as truth. It replaces mystery with process. How do we know this? Who made it? Why does it feel real? These questions do not weaken imagination. They strengthen resilience. The Slender Man case endures not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. It showed us that belief can be nurtured unintentionally, that children can build moral frameworks from fiction when no alternative framework is offered. That empathy can be overridden not by cruelty, but by fear framed as responsibility. Most of all, it showed us that silence is not neutral. When adults avoid uncomfortable conversations about online content, they don't remove influence. They surrender interpretation. Someone else fills that space. An algorithm, a community, a story that never sleeps. So slow down here, at the end. Resist the urge to resolve this neatly. There is no villain to defeat, no single rule to enforce. Only a responsibility that persists as long as stories do. If a story online feels real to a child, who teaches them how to question it? Let that question linger. Let the silence do its work.